On today's show, you'll hear investor perspectives on the COVID-19 impact on the cannabis market. This is Investor Perspectives. I'm the host of Investor Connect, Hall T. Martin, where we connect startups and investors for funding. It's the time of COVID-19. Cannabis is currently gaining regulatory approval across the U.S. The lockdown has declared certain sectors, including cannabis, to be an essential service. We have investors and startup founders describe the impact of COVID-19 on the cannabis market. I hope you enjoy this episode. My first guest is Tibby Erdely of Key Investment Partners. Do you think the acceleration of regulatory would come at the state level or at the national level? There's quite a bit of excise tax funding the state of California has received. I think they've had $1 billion in the last 2 years come in, and it's hard to turn away from that. And then there's also job creation that comes out of it. Or do you think that most states will just wait for the federal government to do it at some later stage?
If I had the answer to that question, I'd be picking deals out of a magic hat and putting them into our fund here. But, the truth is, our house view is that this will likely increase the pace at which states legalize at the state level to begin with. So you're at a point in time today where you've got 33 states that have legalized some form of medical or adult use cannabis. Of those states, there's quite a few that are looking to further legalize from medical to adult use. Those are conversations that have been going on pre-COVID. Those are conversations where there are legislators that are basically standing on the edge of the diving board, if you will, already. But we think that the pandemic-induced recession that we find ourselves in is really going to be that extra nudge that some of these legislators, in order to legalize for reasons like you just pointed out, increased job creation, ways to make up for means and loss in tax revenue. Some of the states that we think could turn rather quickly will be, for example, the tri-state area. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut were pretty close to legalizing adult use rec last year. We think that this is going to be the event that leads them to ultimately go and make those changes to full adult use states. Now, the federal level, it's an interesting question, right? We find ourselves in an election year. We find ourselves where you've got new states coming online. You could find yourself in a year or two where you now have, call it 40 plus medical marijuana states, really basically reaching a point of critical mass where we think it's going to make sense for the feds to come in and legalize. So I think that as states continue to legalize, you're going to see it become a much broader topic at the federal level. In fact, if you do a little bit of research and you look over the last 20 years, the number of marijuana-related bills that have been introduced to Congress have increased pretty exponentially over just the past few years, going from just a couple in the early 2000s, every year, to upwards of 15 to 20 bills being introduced, on a yearly basis to Congress. So we think that regulatory momentum on the federal side is certainly there. And there's several ways that could happen. In the short term, you could see our dear President Trump saying this was my idea all along. And if the Democrats are looking to potentially run with it on their platform, you could see him taking that away from them as a means to continue down his path. And then you could also see the Democrats come in and say, it's about time. The banking situation is something that certainly needs to be figured out. Public and popular opinion pretty much all vote and poll towards the legalization of cannabis today. We really don't view this as a partisan issue anymore. This one is definitely going on both sides of the aisle. And you certainly see a lot of Republican senators and congressmen that are starting to get behind the cannabis industry as well. So while I can't say for sure, I would say it's a matter of time, and COVID will likely increase that timeline for all of us.
My next guest is Kim Rail of Azuka. Now that we've gone through COVID-19 and still making our way through, apparently, what's your updated investment thesis for this sector, or how do you think COVID has changed the investment thesis for this sector?
So I think that there's a lot of good news for the sector. I think that COVID is going to be, at a macro level, is going to be a catalyst for some accelerated legislative changes. So I talked about the CBD changes earlier, but I also think that, if you look at what Congress has been doing to stimulate the economy, it's very expensive, right? So Congress has the opportunity now to do some economic stimulus for using the cannabis industry that will not drain the Treasury. And what I mean by that is there are a couple of pieces of legislation. One's called the States Act, which basically says the states can regulate the cannabis industry however they see fit. And the federal government, this is not going to bug you. And then there's another piece of legislation called the Safe Banking Act, which kind of brings rational access to the cannabis sector in financial services. So right now, there are challenges with financial services in the cannabis industry. So Congress can pass those two pieces of legislation with basically no Treasury impact and provide a stimulus to the fastest growing industry in the country. So I see, and as state and local governments look at, these gaping budget gaps that they're going to have coming out of COVID, legalization on a state and local level, I think is also going to be accelerated. So mega, I think really good news. I think that COVID will accelerate the industry. I think I don't know that it's exactly mixed news from an investor thesis perspective, but I think that there's going to be, a lot of shakeout in the industry. So I saw one piece of data from a group called the Brightfield Group that specializes in the hemp CBD industry. And they were tracking over 3,500 CBD brands in the US at the beginning of 2020. So that's not sustainable, right? Most of them don't, have either the innovation or the balance sheet or the management teams to really grow those into grown-up companies. So I think there's going to be natural shakeout. I think it will be accelerated by COVID. But I think in the end, what will happen is really kind of a natural industry maturation, right? And that is going to be driven by, there'll be winners and losers, right? The winners are going to be companies that have basic solid business practices, all right? Quality, profitable business models, good management teams, focus on innovation, discipline around cash. I mean, that's critical right now. And there's been a lot of cash flushed in the industry. I'm sure you've read all about that. And the other thing that's going to drive, the winners and losers in the maturation is consumer experience, right? New consumers are coming to cannabis. We need to give those new consumers a high quality, highly predictable, and in the case of edibles, great tasting experience. So I think those are going to be the big dynamics in the industry. And in the end, brands with, true brand authenticity and excellent management teams are going to win. And it's going to be a great industry to be in. So I mean, I kind of summarize all of that from an investment thesis perspective is I think that ingestibles are going to be the fastest growing subsegment in cannabis. I think cannabis is going to remain overall the fastest, if not probably the fastest, but at least one of the fastest growing industries on the planet, unlike any other that I see right now. And like I said, I came out of 20 years in the tech industry, so I've been through a lot of cycles there. And I think consumers are going to be, really smart. They're going to want great products that are predictable, that have very high quality, that have been tested for contaminants and pesticides and heavy metals. I mean, there's just, the old era of, bad cannabis, dirty cannabis, that's over. The consumers will not put up with it anymore. So I think it's a great industry to be in if you have a passion for quality, if you have, passion for creating a customer experience that really is helpful to people. It helps them either medically or, for adult use applications.
Legalization, is speeding it up. And, I was going to do it in 5 years. Let's do it next year now because I need the tax revenue. I need the jobs. And it was on our plan to do it anyway. So let's just go ahead and get it on with it now.
I think that conversation is happening today in every state legislature that doesn't have adult use. Right. And the ones that were close, and I live in New Mexico. I think we will have adult use passed in our next legislative session. So, and I think that trend is going to be pretty widespread. So, 33 states already have medical use, right? And we have 10 or 11 with adult use in the US now. And a number that have been really close either by, ballot or legislative initiatives very recently. So I absolutely think it's going to accelerate the growth of the industry and the legalization in those states. Again, because, if I'm a city manager and I'm looking at, or, a governor and I'm looking at next year's budget, because of COVID, I've got a serious budget deficit to deal with. And this is, supporting the cannabis industry and moving, allowing the market to move off the black market, right? so that the states and localities can capture the revenue stream and customers can be assured of safe product that's been tested, which you don't have in the black market. So there are certain safety issues in the black market. So I think there's a lot of reasons for states to move towards legalization, but I think COVID absolutely is accelerating it.
Great. I did too. I think when people see it's fait accompli, it's going to happen anyway, might as well do it now and start capturing the revenue and the jobs that come with it, because COVID has left quite a hole in most states' budget because of all the pandemics and the lockdowns that are going on. And they're also looking for new revenue streams. Retail is going away. Cannabis is coming in. And let's get after that is what I think we'll see as well. So I think you're right on with that as well. In the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Good question. I would say one thing that I would mention about the Azuka approach to edibles that I think is really differentiated out there is our process was created by the founder, Ron Silver. And Ron's kind of a household name in the New York brunch scene. He's a lifelong chef, lifelong cannabis aficionado. And Ron solved this edibles issue wearing his chef's hat. So, and that's really important because as I've, wandered around the industry the last few years and talked to other people who are trying to solve, the quote edibles problem of fast onset, they're approaching it kind of as chemists in laboratories. And the result is approaches that taste awful. I have to say, I have sampled a lot of really horrible tasting CBD products at industry shows. And I've also, as I've interviewed other executives in the industry about their pain points, they've shared with me that other technologies that they've tried related to fast acting, they break down in certain conditions. They can't handle high heat, or they can't handle, the pH of the gummy batch, or they don't have a long shelf life. They're not shelf stable. The molecules break down or the bonds break down. So our approach actually has solved all of those problems with the chef's hat, so they always taste great. So I think the combination of that is a game changer. And I think I'm excited to give this creation to the cannabis consumers of the world.
My next guest is Ford Smith of Ultra Native. Based on COVID, how have you updated your investment thesis for this sector? What did you change in what you look for or what you fund?
Right when COVID started, I was looking at putting some money into a pretty interesting brick and mortar strategy, a dispensary chain. There was a group that had about 10 or 11 licenses lined up here in the Southern California area. I really liked the founder and CEO, the team, the brand strategy, the narrative, kind of the layout and look and feel of the dispensary chain. And, just to be completely honest, as soon as COVID hit, that interest kind of it died kind of, as quick as it started. And so it became very clear. I mean, it's always been clear to me for the past, 3-4 years, having been involved with Ease, that the future was, or my belief was that the future was really that direct to consumer model. And this just kind of hammered it home for me. It was like, just kind of double down on those direct to consumer last mile channels as opposed to these brick and mortar strategies. And that's probably been the biggest change for me. Let me think if there's kind of anything else. I think another thing is, finding ways for, if they are, without actually making an investment into the dispensary supply chain, investing in technologies that help engage the consumer. So if they are actually going into the dispensary, how does a brand build a relationship with that consumer? Because, historically you go into the shop, you pick up a product as a consumer, you take it home, you consume it. There's no follow through. Maybe that consumer likes the brand and they want to go to Instagram and follow them, but there's really no way, that dispensary is like it's a barrier between the brand and the consumer. And so, started looking at, technologies that could actually connect the brand with the consumer so that, look, if you've been fortunate enough to put a brand on a dispensary shelf and actually, have a sale, it's in your best interest to really kind of retain that customer. And so I think through these times, where there is a little bit of confusion, how do you just make sure that in the times where maybe the customer isn't going to the dispensary all the time and seeing your brand and being reminded of it, how do you actually, launch email campaigns, social initiatives to really kind of stay in contact and keep them kind of on top of mind. So that's something that we've taken a heavy interest in.
So you think it's just going to shift from being the dispensary to direct consumer, e-commerce, online, delivered to your door in some cases, and that's going to be the future? Or do you think dispensaries are finding a new way of staying in business, sampling, experimentation, and so forth? Where do you think the dispensary is going to end up in this?
It's tough to say. I mean, look, I'm highly biased, right? Having, participated and been an investor in a company like Ease, it's hard. It's always been hard for me to I've always kind of had my blinders on, and, I'm young and I get everything delivered. There are everyone, here in Los Angeles, we're fortunate enough to have some pretty cool restaurants and shops that kind of have these experiential angles that, you love to go and meet and kind of hang out with friends at. Am I meeting with friends at a dispensary? No. Are there some cool things that I think could be added into that experience? Absolutely. Yes. I've tried the Cannabis Cafe. It was an interesting, experience. I wasn't drawn to go back. I think that I think that what we've seen here in Los Angeles with the cannabis consumption lounges, I think that's just the beginning. I think that we're going to start to experiment and probably develop those business models further, that might draw, consumers and kind of keep them coming back. My local coffee shop, I want to go to every day. So yeah, I think that that's probably the future. I guess to answer your question, I think direct to consumer is the future. It's just too easy. I think once you figure out what once you start really dialing in some of these product recommendation engines and we really start knowing more about the plant and educating the consumer properly, they no longer will need to go into the dispensary and actually interface with anybody. They can do it from, the comfort of their home. And so I do tend to believe that direct to consumer is the future.
Thank you for joining us today. As always, be sure to leave a review, subscribe to this podcast, and share it with others. Let's go start up something today. Alti Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for the basis of investment decisions.